So in this first section, I'm going to read to you. I'm just trying to imagine how such a character as Lincoln would have presented himself to the young Mary Todd. Now, her sister, Elizabeth Edwards, who's one of the doyens in Springfield high society, is throwing a spring solstice ball. And Mary has just learned that Joshua Speed, the handsome young blade that she's been crushing on, is also there. So this is where we pick that up. And yes, it's right here. Here we go. Joshua Speed's coat fit him as lightly as feathers. His boots looked as if they had been blacked at the door. But what struck Mary most forcibly was his hair, which had lain hidden from view during their last encounter and which now rippled in chestnut waves down to his collar. A prodigal mane that had the effect of both lengthening and poeticizing his face. Yes, she thought, this must have been how Lord Byron looked, training his gaze upon some alpine lass. Good evening, she remembered to say. She slid a damp tendril off her face and glanced into the empty space where Mercy, her friend, had just stood. I fear I've come too late to make it onto your program, he said. Oh, she stared at the tiny book still dangling from her wrist. I believe I have a waltz open. Then, he said, the night is not lost. He bent over the program, wrote out his name in a light, casual hand. How those flowers become you. I regret to inform you they are silk. Give me a few more weeks and I shall have real ones to conjure with. I hope you will set one aside for me then. She smiled and shifted her eyes just to the west of him, an attitude of maidenly abstraction refined over some years that had the usual effect of calling out another compliment more lavish than the previous. In this case, Mr. Speed said only, there's someone you should meet. He swung his head around in an arc of expectation, only no one was there. With no great delicacy, he leaned in the direction of the foyer and beckoned with his arm. Against all expectations, a figure came lumbering toward them. Her first impressions arrived singly, refusing to be reconciled. An El Greco frame stretched beyond sufferance, a mournful well of eye, a face of bones, all badgering to break through. From here, all was confusion. Mr. Speed, who gave every sign of wanting to remain, was being called away, and Mary was reaching out a hand to stay him, and at the same time, this other man's hand, massive and elemental, was extending toward her, and it was this hand in which her hand now unaccountably rested like a starfish on a boulder. And Mr. Speed was already slipping from view, and Mr. Speed's friend, scarcely audible, was saying something to her. He was saying, I know who you are. But the effect of being recognized was not so tonic as it had been with Mr. Speed. Now it only discomposed her. You must forgive me, she said. I failed to catch your name. Lincoln. Ah. Her brain went scrambling. Her smile, by way of compensation, stood still. I believe you're known to me as well, by repute, I think. I mean, my cousin has spoken of you. John Stewart, yes? He nodded with such an emphatic motion that his chin came nearly to his chest. She ventured an inch further on the limb. If I'm not mistaken, you're partners, are you not? In Cousin John's law practice. Guilty. He was silent for a time, then roused himself enough to add, I'm glad you mentioned Congressman Stewart. I owe him a great deal. Well, he speaks very highly of you, Mr. Lincoln. Was that true? He tells me, what? He says you are quite a force in the courtroom, I think. Oh, well, he gave the punch bowl a stare. I don't have a great deal of book learning, so I expect I'm able to speak to juries at their own level. Ah. The silence came rolling back, sulphurous. But of course, she rallied, my cousin is a fine judge of character, so it may be that you undervalue yourself. Perhaps Cousin John had actually said that. Isn't it funny, she said, galloping ahead. We have never met before, and yet you surely live here in Springfield. That is so. And I've been in your charming city since only last fall, he said. Well, yes. He studied the flounce of her dress. The thing is, Miss Todd, I'm on the circus quite a bit. And then, I've got that pesky body politics interests to attend to. It was such an oblique way to come at the subject that she was a long time following him there. Of course, she said with something like release. You are one of Ninian's comrades in arms in the State House. Guilty again. I believe, in fact, you are a member of the Long Nine. The first stirrings of a smile on his face. The longest of the nine. So I see, she answered in a lighter voice. It seems that whenever I pass our new capital, I shall have you to thank for bringing it here. His head tipped toward his shoulder, and the words came scattering out like loose pennies. I'm sorry, she said. I said it was a whole team of oxen dragging that particular plow. Ah, well, let us hope we can, she plucked softly at her throat, devise a better metaphor for you, Mr. Lincoln, than oxen. I think the plainer you come at me, the better. Silence once more, a great cloud of it, leaching out their last native spark. He had just enough volition left to mutter the words, very pleased, but not enough to finish them. With a bow, he angled his body away and then left the room, maneuvering around each guest in the manner of a barge, navigating sandbars. So, not an auspicious beginning for this couple, but over time they will find commonalities, and Mary will begin to wonder if her own outsized ambitions might find a home in his. Well, at this point, we have all the makings of a classic courtship scenario. Pride and Prejudice, let's say, relocated to Old Springfield. But it was while roaming those streets that I found another figure lurking in the shadows. You've already met him. His name is Joshua Speed. Like Mary, he was a child of Kentucky aristocracy. Like Mary's father, he was the owner of a dry goods store. And this is the first moment in the story when he takes over the telling of it. I'm going to find this real quick. This will be so fast. Hold on. Yes. It was everything you'd expect of a wedding. The air thick with lilies and gladioluses, candles gleaming from every sconce and niche, the parlor furniture in clean rows, and supper still warm in the adjoining room. Why then was everyone so sad? Friends from earliest boyhood, relations long departed, mother, sitting downcast in an armchair, father, glum in his best silk coat. Everywhere Joshua turned, he found a pall, black wool, black crepe. Even the bride stood with her back turned in a black gown and veil. But as he traveled down the aisle, every face in the room suddenly turned toward his and gathered into a smile. How pleased they were to see him. The bride, no less so, for she was turning toward him now in the tiniest of gradients, and at the same time reaching for her veil, and the news was striking home with the force of a lance. This was his wedding, his and no one else's. Sweat spangled his brow as a great fog began to roll through the room, shrouding all the guests, until the only thing remaining was the bride, lifting her veil, inch by inch. Here was where he always woke up, sometimes in a great gasp of relief, but more often with shreds of the dream still clinging to him. On those evenings, he would have to lie awake for some time reconstructing the particulars of his own life. You are Joshua Speed. You own a dry goods store in Springfield, Illinois. Your life is peaceable and requires no change. You have never been married. You have no plan to be married. It was a curious process, like untying the noose from around his own neck. And it left him a little queasy that he could be so unmanned by an illusion, unmanned even more by the idea of sharing it with some other. That's how he knew things had changed between them, because one night, as they lay in bed, he at last spoke of his dream, trusting perhaps in the concealment of dark. Huh, said Lincoln after a moment of silence. I get that one too, all the time. Well, by now it may be clear that it was Joshua Speed's bed that Lincoln shared. He shared it for 3.5 years. and the room over Joshua Speed's dry goods store. At this point, the customary caveat rushes in. Beds and bedding were expensive in those days. Bachelors were often obliged to share sleeping quarters. What made these two bachelors different was the degree of their intimacy. And to call that home, I'm going to just read one last passage from the book. Let's see. One December evening, polishing their boots before the back hearth, they fell to speaking of their escapes. Joshua told of Sangamon County belles, who had clung a little too close, of flirtations that had ended, on one side anyway, in tears. Mother's hopes dashed, future dynasties extinguished. In the telling of it, the faces tended to blur, but the names survived, a litany of recrimination. And so did the unanswered question, how had things so gotten out of hand? Why had Francis Goodwin, at the sight of him, run sobbing from the room? Why had Jane Bell, in a voice of choked choler, called him a liar and a cheat? Why had Emily Shore's brother made noises about a duel? With each girl, he could reconstruct his behavior down to the last syllable and find no infamy. Never once had he pressed an advantage, never once had he promised more than he could honor. He had merely been agreeable, which was all he'd ever been trained to be. The harm, said Lincoln upon reflection, is in being so unforgivingly handsome. Lincoln's experiences were of a different character. No mother had ever pinned her hopes on him. Flirtation, badinage, and direction were foreign to him. His way was to blunder through all corners, and now and then such a man blunders into someone else. Lincoln spoke then of the New Salem matron who had tried to bind him to her sister. This sister, said Joshua, what was her name? Mary Owens. What did she look like? Lincoln's lips folded down. Apple cheeks, dark curly hair, blue eyes, a little advanced in years. Well, she was my age, which was nearly the same thing. You got on with her? Tolerably. There was talk of marriage. There was talk, I suppose, but from my side, it was only in jest. She went back to Greene County, though, with a meaningful look on her face. We exchanged a letter or two, and I very nearly forgot about her. But 3 years later, she was back, flush with understanding. And how did you respond? Lincoln smiled grimly, shook his head. First, I had to make sure it was the same girl. Looking on her yesterday, I couldn't stop thinking of my mother. What, wrinkles? It was more her want of teeth and the whole weather-beaten look of her. I tried to imagine her handsome, and the hell of it she was. It seemed to me that no woman I'd ever seen had a finer face. I tried to convince myself that the mind was much more to be valued than the person. Oh, Brother Abraham. And then I just delayed the matter as long as I could. Finally, there was nothing for it but to screw my courage to the sticking place and bring everything to a head. Which is to say, you made a proposal? Direct. And Lincoln folded a hand over his mouth, his eyes crinkled. She said no. She didn't. At first, I took it for modesty, but when I came back at her, she said no with ever greater vigor. It was no and no. Joshua smiled gently. Oh, I was mortified in 100 different ways to think she had rejected me with all my fancied greatness. And I think I'd been too stupid to grasp how perfectly indifferent she was to me the whole time. And then on top of that, what? I began to think I really was a little in love with her. Just a little? I don't know. Joshua lofted another log on the fire, poked it until the sparks streamed upward in a column. That was quite a muddle, he said. Muddle is all I ever get into with women. They sat for a time, rubbing down their boots, frowning at the flames. What is the moral lesson for you, I wonder, said Joshua. Never again to think of marrying, because you can't find anyone to suit. because I could never be satisfied with anyone who'd be blockhead enough to have me. Joshua laughed a little more. That is a vow I can get behind. They touched glasses. To bachelorhood, said Lincoln. To brotherhood, said Joshua. So in further trying to define this relationship, I fall back on the words of Joshua Speed himself. No two men were ever closer. Carl Sandburg, writing in the early 20th century, went a little further, suggesting that Lincoln and Speed had, quote, streaks of lavender about them. And in recent decades, scholars like C.A. Tripp and Charles Strozier have begun to investigate the nature of this relationship. Why did such an attractive man as Speed wait so long to marry? Why did Lincoln himself hold off on marrying until Speed had gone to the altar? Why did he demand that Speed write him the day after his wedding to tell him how the wedding night had gone? These and other questions have generated robust differences of opinion. I can't hope to resolve them with a single book, nor would I want to. I can only say that when I first read Lincoln's letters to Speed, one of which is reproduced in the book, I found two men actually trying to coax and coach each other toward what we would now call a normative heterosexual lifestyle. And with that, this relatively straightforward courtship story became a love triangle, with Lincoln himself at the center, and with Mary Todd and Joshua Speed as dual narrators, sometime rivals, and also sometime allies. The result, I hope, is a novel that honors all three parties, including the enigmatic Mr. Lincoln, who walks and talks and bleeds on these pages, literally bleeds. At the same time, I hope it reaffirms and reanimates the essential riddle of why people come to love each other. At one point in the story, Mary Todd asks, how could anyone be known, anyone at all, here on God's green earth? To me, it's the premise of fiction that we can at some level know, and at the same time never know, and we can live and even thrive in that tension. So in that spirit, I give you the 9,101st book about Abraham Lincoln, with the hope that it finds in you open hearts and open minds. I'd like to conclude with a poem. This was the poem that actually was a Pablo Neruda poem that I actually wanted to be the epigraph for this book. Unfortunately, the Pablo Neruda estate demanded money for that privilege. That was money that I was not willing to cough up at the time. So in retaliation, I'm now reading this poem out loud wherever I go in the land. It's just 4 lines of a poem, actually, but it seems to speak so well to the themes of this book. I do not love you as if you were salt rose or topaz, or the arrow of carnations the fire shoots off. I love you as certain dark things are to be loved in secret between the shadow and the soul. And that is the region, I think, where this book dwells, where it properly dwells. And just one last thing, you know, I talked about it being a mystery writer. And this book was, I'm a recovering mystery writer in some ways. And this book was partly occasioned by yet another mystery, which is the mystery of Abraham Lincoln's nervous breakdown, which happened in the January of 1842. Now, this was the worst depressive episode of his entire life, bar none, up to and including the death of his sons and the Civil War. And scholars traditionally spend a lot of time trying to figure out why it happened. And they looked for a clue to Lincoln's own cryptic comment about the fateful 1st of January 1842. And they said, oh, well, that was the day that he broke off his engagement with Mary Todd, his fiance. That must have been the trauma that triggered this whole episode. But something else happened that day, which was that Joshua Speed informed him that he was leaving Springfield and going back home to Kentucky. So these were twin traumas capping 2 very intense relationships, both happening at the same time. So that is, in fact, how I justify the 9,101st book about Abraham Lincoln, because I'm not sure that everybody has quite yet captured this particular window into Lincoln's world, into Mary Todd's world, into Joshua Speed's world. So that is one of the the things that brought this book about. And with that, I want to stop talking and just see if folks have questions, which I'm happy to answer. And thank you for listening.
All right, please feel free to unmute yourselves to ask questions, or you can type your questions in the chat box.
I have a question.
Yes.
My question is, when you wrote the book, obviously you did a lot of research.
Mhm.
And my question is, I know a lot of the dialogue has to be made up because
Right.
it's a book of fiction. But the events, did you stick to the events or did you add events? For example, the one I was thinking about was when she told Lincoln that if he wanted to woo her, he should bring her a bunch of ballots wrapped in a ribbon, and he did.
Right.
Did that really
Yeah.
happen?
That really did happen. That really did happen. Thank you for asking about that. That is it, and it formed for me the perfect climax of that particular section, because he was wooing her, he was finding her eros, right, which was politics, and I love that moment. I knew as soon as I read about that I had to use that as much as I could. I would say most of the stuff in the book either happened or is my projection of what happened. Obviously, you mentioned the dialogue. There's so much stuff that's happening. Yeah, that these scenes, these parlor scenes, these very intimate domestic scenes where nobody was present, nobody was recording it. So yeah, that is my novelist, my fictional self going in and imagining my way in and wondering how it might have been. The rest of it is either in the record or it's just me imagining my way into the record. To me, the historical novelist goes in wherever the record falls silent. You know, we go into those empty spaces, and they're sometimes quite vast, and try to imagine ourselves, how did it happen? Here's one idea for how it happened. For those of you who have read, I don't know if anyone's read the whole book yet, but there's a climactic journey that Mary Todd makes over the course of the book. To avert a duel on the duel really almost happened. It almost happened on a place called Bloody Island in the Mississippi River. But Mary was not there, but I needed her to be there. And that was the only reason that I sent her there. I wanted her to be there because I felt she needed to be, fictionally, she needed to be there. And I make no apologies about that. To me, my allegiances are always to the story. And if, as much as I can hew to history, I will, but if I need to rejiggle chronology, if I need to change things up, I will, because I'm telling a story that just happens to involve real life characters. That's how I feel. So, and thank you for that question.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Do you try to write your dialogue in the style of 19th century speech?
I would call it a hybrid of 19th century and modern speech, because I think if you try to do dialogue, or for that matter, write prose, that's 19th century, it would come off as extremely stilted. And maybe, to me, it would be just a meaningless stunt, because we no longer read that way. We make allowances, of course, when we're reading Jane Austen, who was a big inspiration for the book, or Dickens, or we make allowances when we're reading those authors, but when we come to a work of modern fiction, even if it's historical fiction, I think we don't want to feel that we're stuck. And so I think what I try to do, consciously or unconsciously, is a hybrid between then and now. David Mitchell, the great British novelist, is referred to it as antiquing, where you take what would be a normal sentence and maybe you add a slightly antique word, or you change the order of the words, so it just feels a little bit antique. It doesn't feel like somebody's sitting in a coffee house or tweeting, right? It feels a little bit antique, but it also feels accessible. And that's, to me, is the challenge of the historical novelist, is trying to bridge those two worlds, because I don't want a reader to feel that that's far away. I want them to feel like this is happening now. So the more immediate I can make it without completely spoiling the illusion that it's the past, the better off, I think, the better experience I think it is for the reader.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I don't know if, am I on?
Yes, you are.
Okay, okay. First of all, I just wanted you to know I had taken your class at Ollie first,
Oh, okay.
and then I got the book as well as the Pale Blue Eye, and just enjoyed them so much and
Oh, thank you.
presented it to my book club who's here tonight. So I just wondered why you think so many people, especially Lincoln lovers, are so unfamiliar with Joshua Speed. He seems so important to Lincoln's life. And everybody I talked with said, who? I've never heard of
Who
him.
is that? Who is that?
Yes.
I think there's this. I do think there's a certain amount of embarrassment. I will say that Lincoln's earliest biographers, I'm blanking on the name, is John Hay. I think the earliest biographers acknowledged that Speed was the closest, Lincoln's closest friend through life. They acknowledged that, but the nature of the relationship was, I think, made people feel awkward. There were efforts by some of Lincoln's friends to kind of, because there wasn't a big girl trail. Lincoln was not, he didn't leave a lot of broken hearts where he went. So there were efforts to kind of, butch him up a little bit. William Herndon, who was a very important, the first sort of oral biographer of Lincoln and his former law partner, and maybe the most influential biographer of Lincoln who ever was, came up with stories about him catching venereal disease and going to prostitutes, and they're just not very convincing based on what we know of Lincoln. So I think there was a certain amount of embarrassment. I will say I went to Springfield, Illinois, obviously, to do some research. I didn't stay there that long, but I went to the Lincoln House, the National Park Service house, and I listened to the video. They make all the tourists watch before they do anything else, and it was fascinating because they referred to Joshua Speed as a roommate, not a bedmate. They referred to him as a roommate, and they kind of they cut straight from there to Mary Todd. There's no sense that these men had this very intense relationship. Now, I should say that I don't know myself if the relationship crossed a boundary into sexual, but it seems to me that whatever the nature of their relationship was, it was keeping them from being married. It was keeping them from following these paths that they were supposed to be following as men of that era. I will also say too that historical scholarship has caught up with it. Back in 2008, C.A. Tripp, who was a Kinsey Institute scholar, wrote a book called The Intimate Life of Abraham Lincoln. It was very controversial at the time because he posited that Lincoln was homosexual. And he listed all the men that Lincoln had shared a bed with, So it was denounced at the time. But I think in the last 10 or 20 years, scholars have started sort of investigating, hey, what was going on here? Regardless of sexual intimacy, where was the emotional intimacy? Was the difficulty in the Lincoln-Todd marriage, was it just his natural reticence, or was it because his emotions lay elsewhere? So I think we're hopefully we'll get to a point where people know who Joshua Speed is, because I will say if you go to Louisville, Kentucky, the name is everywhere, but they still don't want to talk about this. So
Thank you.
Thank you for asking them.
All right, we have another question in the chat.
Okay.
Were Speed and Lincoln the same age? Do you know if Speed stayed married, raised a family? Did Lincoln and Speed keep in touch after their marriages?
All great questions. They were close to the same age. Lincoln was a little bit older. They did stay in touch, but they were never as close again as they were in Springfield, Illinois. Speed did get married to a woman named Fanny. They did not have children. So that could be, who knows what that is? That could be infertility, or it could be whatever. There are different explanations for it. They did stay in touch through the years. Interesting, one of the things that got in the way was slavery. Speed, as the book makes clear, Speed and his family, Kentucky family, were slave owners. They considered themselves enlightened slave owners. And Lincoln, of course, was having nothing to do with that. He was not, as you probably know, an abolitionist in any meaningful sense, but he was an opponent of slavery. He thought it was a stain on the honor of America. So they did that. This was a source of tension for them for the years, but they stayed in touch, and periodically Lincoln would offer him jobs. And actually, Joshua's older brother James became Lincoln's second Attorney General. Also, during the Civil War, the Speed brothers were instrumental in keeping Kentucky out of the Confederacy, which was a major service. And I should say, again, not to tip it for people who haven't read the book, but the epilogue contains, again, an actual moment that happened where Speed and Lincoln reunite. This is just shortly after Lincoln's been elected to the presidency, a few months before his inauguration, and he's in a Chicago hotel. And he and Mary Todd Lincoln meet Joshua and his wife in the Speed's hotel room. And then Lincoln at some point says, this is in the record, says, you know what, Josh and I are just gonna go in the bedroom and chat. Just, carry on. They close the door after them. Who knows what the wives were thinking. And then Lincoln, they talk, Lincoln offers him another job in the cabinet, which Speed once again turns down. But then at some point, Lincoln just sort of throws himself into the bed and curls himself in the same position that he had last assumed in Springfield, Illinois, as though kind of picking up right where they left off. So I had my own fictional cap to that, but to me, that was such an evocative moment. In response to the previous questioner, I think we're still catching up to these resonances, regardless of what name we want to put to it. This was an interesting relationship, and I don't know that as a culture we're quite caught up to it.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why do you like writing about real historical people as opposed to made up fictional character?
I've done both. I wrote a young adult novel called Lucky Strikes about this girl in the Appalachians, sort of in Blue Ridge Mountains, actually during the Depression, and she was completely made up. She actually just sort of appeared to me out of the blue. I like the challenge of kind of taking these real life people and figuring out what made them tick. Now, historians again can do that to a certain degree. History can tell us so much, but only so much. And it's again, where we can't find clues, we can't find actual data, hard accounts, primary accounts. That's where, to me, the novelist gets to go in and exalt and say, okay, well, this is how I think it. And I just find it fun. I just find it fascinating to do that. And I've done it with, I did it, speaking of presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, I did a book about his trip through the Brazilian jungle, and Edgar Allan Poe when he was a cadet at West Point, and what else? Oh, a real life French detective named Vidocq in Paris, who was the inspiration for Javert and Jean Valjean, both actually in Les Miserables. So it's just fun to get into these real lives and try to figure out these mysteries. And it does, I keep using the word mystery, but it does come back to me. There's some mystery that I'm wanting to solve. And it feels like only a fiction writer can solve it, because there's no smoking gun, there's no direct evidence for what's going on. So.
But don't you find it inhibiting, thinking, oh, would this real historical person really have done this or really have thought this? And
I don't find it inhibiting, but I've been asked that. I find it more a useful template. It's like, okay, so this is the Lincoln that we know from the record. So whatever I have him do has to fit within that template. I feel that much responsibility anyway, not much more, but that much responsibility to kind of create a Lincoln who fits within our understanding of him, and the same with Mary Todd, and the same with Lincoln. So no, I don't feel inhibited, and if anything, it's these open spaces that kind of I feel like I have room to kind of roam. But I know that other writers might feel that that way. I just don't. I find it just a gas. When I see Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt doing the president's race at one of the Nationals games, I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I wrote about two of you. I don't think I'll be writing about Taft or any of those guys, but it's fun. I just find it fun. And I think one of the reasons I find it fun is that I know that nothing I write is going to be definitive, because it is, it's fiction. So it's by its very nature, it's just a speculative inquiry into what's going on. So I know that nothing I do is going to change. I don't think. I'd be surprised to know it would change anything about our basic understanding of these people. And I also become very fond of these people. I was deeply fond of Mary Todd as a result of researching this book. And I think it shows in the book, because I think it shows how fond I am of her. I think she was really cool and a very misunderstood figure. So I'm glad to be, if talking about, in this case, I hope that I can be part of changing how people think about her, because I think she was wonderful.
Would you ever write about someone still alive?
No, although I will say my current book is about Jack Kennedy and Jacqueline Bouvier, it's another courtship book, another dead president book. So they're all gone, but there are, for the first time in my experience, there are people alive who knew them, who also knew the narrator of the particular narrator of the book. And that is a little weird for me, because oh gosh, I used to make this joke about I write about dead people because they can't sue.
Right.
And I don't think that they can, I don't think any of these guys can actually sue me. But it is weird to think that there are people, if this book goes down the world, that there are people who is like, oh wait, that didn't happen like that. That didn't, there'll be these voices. Yeah. But there have been so much stuff about the Kennedys that I feel like mine is just one more in the pile, one of the 9,100 books about the Kennedys, that's been written. So anyway.
All right, we have some questions in the chat.
Okay.
What were your best resources in researching the background? What authors have influenced you the most? And what do you think of Sandberg's Lincoln? Historically accurate or not so much? Lots of questions.
3 questions. All right. So Renee, remind me if I miss that. So I'll start with Sandberg's Lincoln. The reason I loved reading it, I just read one thing I need to make clear, I only read the stuff that pertains to this particular period. So I know nothing about Lincoln after he marries Mary Todd. I didn't even know what happened. Did he become president? I don't even know. I just stopped. The research just stops there. So that's the thing. The thing I need to make clear as a novelist is I never become an expert on anything. I just learn enough to kind of conjure with in this particular world, this story world, universe that I want to talk about. But I will say that I loved the Sandberg book that I read because it was so evocative. He was a poet, of course, so he did a really wonderful job of evoking what it was like to live in Springfield, Illinois back in 1841. I mean, this was a very raw frontier town. There were no sidewalks, the streets were mud. There were no street lights. It was raw. And yet at the same time, there was this very stratified society, high society built on top of it, imported mostly from Kentucky, with salons and people, women in very fancy gowns. And so it was this weird tension between a frontier town still expanding to the west, and then this very codified Southern kind of civilization. So that was interesting. And Sandberg does a wonderful job of just conveying the sensuality of that period. Okay, walking back, what was the one before that, Renee?
It was, what authors have influenced you the most?
Oh my gosh, where to begin? There's so many, but I will say the author I think who influenced me the most was probably Charles Dickens, because he was the writer that I read most growing up. And my first historical novel was Mr. Timothy, and it was about Tiny Tim, who was the Dickens character I liked the least. So I figured the whole book is my attempt to kind of to mess him up and figure out what's there on the other side of that. So I would say Dickens, but of the current historical novelists, I'm such a fan of Hilary Mantel. and her Wolf Hall trilogy.
Mhm.
I think she does an extraordinary job of just bringing the past to life and making it, as I said, immediate. It doesn't feel like you're reading about something that happened, 500 years ago. It just feels like it's happening in front of you. And I think she's so exceptional. I have not read the current volume because it's long and I've been kind of busy, but I'm going to get to it. But the first two volumes I thought were just exceptional. I just find her just unfailingly interesting when she writes. And then what was the first question?
The first one was, what were your best resources in researching the background?
Best resources. Well, I always do go to the primary sources. The guy mentioned before, William Herndon, was enormously valuable to biographers and to novelists because he was the first oral biographer. He was Lincoln's law partner for many years. And after Lincoln's death, he went around and basically did what was then a very novel thing to do, which was interview people, including everybody who'd ever known Lincoln, his step siblings, his stepmother who adored him, and all the people who'd ever known him, and just take this testimony down and collect it and harvest it. So he's enormously valuable, but he also was deeply biased against Mary Todd Lincoln. They did not get along. And in fact, his whole biography of Lincoln is really a concerted act of revenge against her, where he drags up the memory of, oh gosh, I'm blanking on her name. This girlfriend he supposedly had in New Salem, Anne.
Oh, and somebody.
Yes.
Begins with an R. Rutledge.
Anne Rutledge. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. So Anne Rutledge was this young woman who died in New Salem, to whom Lincoln was very close. It's not at all clear that it was a romantic relationship, but Herndon turned it into sort of the love of Lincoln's life, and she tragically died, and he could never love that way again. And according to his mythos, the Mary Todd sort of understood this and resolved to make Lincoln's life a misery. And so it became evil Mary versus saintly dead Anne. And that story carried forward for another century. If you look at any fictional representation of Lincoln, Abe Lincoln in Illinois, young Abe Lincoln, that mythos is still there. Bad Mary, good Anne, and so so it takes a while, if your enemies are writing your history, it's going to be hard to unwrite that history. So that's but still, he's enormously useful for just showing us people's contemporary recollections of Lincoln and what he was like. And I will also say, I mentioned the letters, the Speed Lincoln letters. They were we only have the letters that Lincoln wrote to Speed, but they just convey a feeling, a really intensity and intimacy, and they're all Googleable on YouTube. You can find any of them, that I just found really fascinating. So in fact, those letters were what made me want to write this book in the first place. So I'm really grateful to them.
Oh, I have a question.
Oh, hi.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Yes. Wasn't Robert Lincoln so hurtful and harmful to his mother?
Yes. Well, yes. He was, it's funny. Well, three of Mary's four children died before adulthood, before Tad got to 20 or 21. So that was part of the tragedy of her life. And to me, and this is just, I think the unexplored issue is the PTSD of, her husband's assassination. She was holding his hand, blood spattered her dress. So I think a lot of the things that happened, after her time in the White House, at least partly can be attributed to that. But yes, Robert Lincoln was the one who committed her to an asylum. And I think contemporary historians are pretty unanimous in thinking that she didn't belong there. She was certainly, she was certainly neurotic. She was certainly acting up in ways, but it's clear I think it's clear to me anyway that he committed her because she was an embarrassment to him. Lois Romano, who's a former Washington Post writer, is working on a nonfiction book about Mary Todd's years after the White House. And I love her working title is An Inconvenient Widow. And that's what I really love. I love that because I think it conveys what it was. Now, I should say that as much as I love young Mary Todd, it's easy to love young Mary Todd. She becomes a more difficult creature as she gets older. I think the more public a figure she became, the more her private demons kind of came to the fore, so that by the time she gets to the White House, she is alienated family members, friends, people who should be her allies. She is waging, tantrums. She's fiercely jealous of Lincoln, which is kind of funny in some context. And she's just, she clearly, there was something wrong with her, but I don't think whatever was wrong with her rose to the level of insanity. So, and I think people are pretty clear about it. The one thing I will finally say on that subject is how smart she was, because when she was committed, she set about getting herself out in a very smart, canny way. She cultivated a journalist. You know about this? Yeah. A female journalist in Chicago, I think. And she's kind of sent stuff her way about all the sort of privations that she was enduring and all this horrible stuff that was happening, and basically helped create this story of gosh, poor Mary Todd Lincoln, and how could this happen? She basically tilted the whole story around so that she became the victim. And the press coverage that got generated basically forced Robert to release her. And she ended up her last days living again with her sister Elizabeth Edwards in the same bedroom in Springfield. But I just think that's such a great example of Mary's intelligence. Like okay, I'm in this situation, how do I get out of it? And she figured out a way. So I'm still a fan of Mary's.
I have another question in the chat.
Yes.
How is it that letters between Lincoln and Speed still exist? At least the ones that Lincoln wrote. Did Speed's family save them and donate them to a museum?
I'm guessing that, I don't know the exact mechanics by which it happened, but Lincoln, of course, was the president. And I'm guessing that in the months after his death, people would have been scrambling to find any kind of thing they had with his signature on it, with anything because they wanted to chronicle him. They wanted to memorialize him. So I'm guessing Speed would have dug up those old letters. It's funny, a few years ago, Larry Kramer, who just died, he wrote the Normal Heart, and he was a big sort of gay gadfly activist, and he was convinced that Lincoln and Speed had a very intense sexual relationship. And he claimed to have found these letters, under a floorboard somewhere that Speed had written, love letters that were written between Speed and Lincoln. In fact, I think if they existed, they were a hoax. So I don't think we're ever going to find love letters. There will be nothing under a floorboard. But again, just the letters that Lincoln wrote to Speed are really they're very evocative of the nature of this relationship. And of course, Speed also talked to William Herndon and shared that anecdote about the Chicago hotel room that came from Joshua Speed. He told William Herndon about that. So there are ways into that. There are ways into that. I should also add that the Sangamon County Register, I think that was the name of the paper. That was the Whig paper. Lincoln was a Whig in those days, and it was the paper for the Whig Party. And you can find it in the library, or you could find it in the Library of Congress, which is 6 blocks from my house. So it was an extraordinary thing to be able to go and just find microfiche of these newspapers where you see the ads that Lincoln posted for his law firm, and you can see Stephen Douglas's ad right below, and realize that these two titans of American history were just sitting in the same hall, drumming up legal business, right, in the middle of Springfield, Illinois. This is why I'm a historical novelist, because I just get tingles when I see things like, oh my God, it's Stephen Douglas, oh my God. And by the way, I should add, Stephen Douglas was also a suitor of Mary Todd. When I talk about, why did Mary choose Lincoln? She had other options. And Stephen Douglas was reportedly besotted with her, supposedly, according to family legend, proposed marriage to her. And supposedly, I don't know if I trust this, but supposedly she said, I will go to the White House, but not with you, something like that. So you look at that and think that Lincoln's he won the election, his presidential election against Stephen Douglas. That was who he defeated in that election. So that was some kind of crazy prescience on her part.
All right, so another question in chat. How is the pandemic affecting your research, like access to the Library of Congress?
Yeah, no, it's cut it off. It's cut that off. It's been a bit of a struggle. What I'm doing, because I mean, there's a lot of stuff online, but the internet doesn't have everything. It really doesn't. And so I've been having to sort of track down some books, just order them kind of in a cheap way. ABE Books is a wonderful kind of resource for used books. So I'm just kind of creating my own study shelf here at home. But it's hard. I'm conscious of these things that I can't really nail down yet. And I'm literally leaving kind of holes in my manuscript saying, okay, once I get back, I will figure this out at some point down the road, exactly where this was, when this happened. But it's a challenge. But again, the internet is an amazing resource, and it's amazing how much stuff you can find on there. I don't even know how I would have gotten by 20, 30 years ago.
Another question in chat. How do you pick the subjects for your books?
That's a great question. My feeling is they pick me. So we'll look at Lincoln. So what happened was I was at the Tucson Book Festival a few years ago. I was interviewing Paula McLean, who wrote a book called The Paris Wife, which is about Hemingway and his first wife.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you guys remember it.
Yeah.
And then the woman that he left her for, right?
Right.
Yeah. And she'd also written a book about, and there was also a book around the same time called Loving Frank. It was about Frank Lloyd Wright.
Oh,
and his
right. Yeah.
So both these books came out at the same time, and they both did really well. And after talking to Paula, who's great, I was thinking, what an interesting template to look at somebody, a famous figure, through the prism of somebody who loved them. What an interesting perspective that is to take. And literally on the plane back from Tucson, I'm thinking, gosh, who else would that work for? You know, who else? And literally, I think Lincoln was the first name that popped into my head. And at the time, it was just that feeling of, wait, how did he get married to that woman? What was going on there? Because that's how she's been passed down to us, that crazy mad woman, right? How did that happen? And so I just started following that trail. And suddenly I thought, I don't know anything about these people. Lincoln, young Mary Todd. I don't know anything about Joshua Speed. I was like, oh gosh. So partly I feel like all my books are ways of educating me about the things that I don't know. And of course they are many. They are many. As I'm writing every book, I find like, oh God, I don't know anything about that. So.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. We have one question in chat. What led you to a career as a writer? And on a more personal note, did our mutual elementary school language arts teacher, Mrs. Cates, have an influence on your writing? And this has come from Sheila.
Who's Sheila? Where is Sheila?
She's raising her hand.
Oh, I'm trying to see her. Okay, hold on. Hi, Sheila. Wait, where is she?
Wave your hand again.
Hi, Louis.
Oh, hi, Sheila. Oh my gosh. See, now you didn't believe me. I'm a local boy, and here's proof. Mrs. Cates. Oh my gosh. I think her first name was Phyllis. That'd be right? Gosh. So this was a program, and Sheila can back me up on any of this stuff. This was a gifted, talented program. We met at Springfield Estates. Is there still a Springfield Estates school? Do we know, Sheila?
Yes.
Yes, there is. Okay. So this was a gifted talent program, and we had these wonderful teachers, Mrs. Cates, Mrs. Bernstein, Mrs. Smith, I want to say. And I don't know, I feel like there were 4 years. I think we moved to Keene Mill at some point. But anyway, this is very Springfield centric, I'm sorry. But anyway, so I do remember kind of the love of learning that I had at that time in my life, and being in this place where that was okay. And when it was over, I will say it was a very tough transition back to being like the nerd, the geek, you know, the person who was, you know, the brain. It was not, I was not well received in that world, and I had to kind of reinvent myself in a weird way. But I have very fond memories of Mrs. Cates and Sheila and all these other wonderful people from that world. We
Louis,
did a lot of reading. Yeah.
Louis,
Corinne?
I'm Sheila's mother. I substituted.
Oh my gosh.
Sometimes for Mrs. Cates,
Hi, Mrs. Murdas. How are you?
but a long
is-
time.
It has been a long time. It has been a long time. Oh, how fun. This is great. Thank you so much for checking in. Oh my gosh, it's been a long time. Yes. Yes. No, I'm so grateful to teachers from the old days. I had a teacher in high school named Miss Hilliard, Jill Hilliard, who shows up periodically, but I don't know if she's, I haven't looked at the crowd yet. But she was the person who kind of just back in high school who just sort of bugged me, you know, in the way that a good teacher does, just to keep writing and enters, you know, contests and apply for scholarships and do all that stuff that, you know, you don't really want to do, but somebody says you should do it, and okay, and then it works out. And so I'm just so grateful to the teachers of my life. They've made such a difference through everything. Yeah, so grateful.
Well,
Sheila.
thank you. Oh, it's a small world for sure.
It is a small world.
Well, Mr. Bayard, thank you so much. This was
Thank you.
wonderful. You opened my eyes to Abraham Lincoln and his
Yeah.
friendship with Joshua Speed. So thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been great. I appreciate you inviting me. This has been great.
You are awesome, Lou. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you,
thanks
guys.
everyone for coming.
All right. Good night. Stay safe, everyone.
Good night.